Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. But not just another Tuesday live stream, a continuation of the Summer of Cscape. All summer long, we're going to be giving you great Cscape 10 content because on July 1st, after years of development, we're finally releasing Cscape 10. Now, if you watched last week, you saw that all summer long, I'm also going to be sharing with you some of my favorite summer activities. Last week, I talked about riding my bicycle on bicycle tours. This week, it's going to be riding trains. And as a matter of fact, and you can probably tell from the lighting and the sounds and the vibrations, I'm riding a train right now. Now, there's lots of things I love about riding the train. I love that I feel like I'm on vacation as soon as I board the train when I'm on my way to my destination. I love the scenery. A lot of the trains I've ridden have spectacular scenery. It's a great way to see the country. I love eating on the train, although to be fair, not all trains have great food. And most of all, I love sleeping on the train. And when I'm going to be sleeping on a train, I always try to get a sleeper compartment like the one I'm in now. Now, during the day, it's basically seats and a table, and I can stretch out and get some work done if I'm working. If on vacation, of course, I'll probably play some games with my wife or maybe do some reading or some puzzles or something. But at night, the seats go down into beds, not as large as a hotel room for sure, but larger than a cot, larger than a tent, a little bit like glamping, if you will. Now, for those of you who might want to add a sleeper train to your bucket list, stick around to the very end after we've done our technical work today, and I'll give you some pointers. Now, here's the next installment of the Summer of Cscape, our topic for today. Last week, we focused on the Cscape 10 user interface. This week, we're taking a look at program downloads in Cscape 10. We've made some significant improvements to program downloads in Cscape 10, especially as it relates to the way that variable values are handled at download. As a matter of fact, based on the feedback I've received over the past couple of years, these particular improvements in variable handling have been requested by more customers than any other logic feature. So let's break down today's topic. Before we dive into the particulars of how program downloads and variable values are handled in Cscape 10, we're going to review how they're handled in Cscape 9. We'll talk about both retentive and non-retentive variable types, how register mapping works, and what happens to register values before and after download. Then, after that review, we'll turn to Cscape 10 and the improvements that we've made in those areas, specifically in the elimination of variable value mismatches and global variable initialization. Okay, let's dive right in. Let's start our review with something fundamental, and that is the different OCS register types that make up the structure of OCS program memory. In nearly every logic language supported by Cscape, register-based advanced ladder, variable-based advanced ladder, or the standard IEC languages, variables created by system designers are ultimately mapped to these memory types, either manually or automatically. I've highlighted the top 3 data types because these are the 3 register types that are used most frequently for user variables in the program. %R memory is word type memory that is used for integer, double integer, and real variables. %M for retentive Boolean variables, and %T for non-retentive Boolean variables. Further on down the list, you can also see the register types dedicated for real-world I/O and system variables. For customers using register-based advanced ladder, the mapping of variables to OCS register space is done manually, and every variable that is created must be mapped by the user. In the graphic on the screen, I've highlighted in blue the variable names, called I/O names, and in yellow the register locations. As you can see, every single variable in the program has been mapped, and it has been mapped manually by the user. For variable-based advanced ladder, which is a more modern approach which more and more customers have been switching to, most variables are mapped by Cscape automatically in the background, and only some variables need to be mapped manually by the user. These exceptions include real-world I/O, where specific I/O terminals need to be mapped to specific variables, and also variables that are shared over a network like Modbus TCP. In variable-based logic, manual mapping by the user is performed using the program variable window, and specifically by filling in the column labeled mapping. As an example, for variables mapped to real-world I/O registers like %I or %Q registers, these variables are created in the global variable section of the program variable window by filling in the mapping column with the specific memory address for that variable. But what about the automatic mapping that Cscape performs in the background for variable-based advanced ladder? What rules does Cscape follow when mapping internal variables, and why does it matter? Let's start with the rules. First, Cscape skips any register address that the user has assigned manually. Those register locations are now reserved and won't be part of the automatic mapping process. Cscape starts with variables created by the user as global variables. What are global variables? Well, in addition to the manually mapped real-world I/O type variables, global variables also include non-retentive Boolean variables. So those are mapped to %T register space, which is the non-retentive memory type. The mapping is performed starting at the lowest available register address, normally T1. The mapping is performed in the order in which the variables are listed in the program variable window, not in alphabetical order, for instance. Any global variables with an integer, double integer, or real data type are mapped to %R memory. Again, these are mapped by Cscape in the order listed, starting at the lowest available address, usually R1. Cscape then moves on in the mapping process to retained variables. Retained Booleans are mapped to %M, and all other data types are mapped to %R. Now, when does this mapping process occur? It occurs every time an error check is performed, whether the error check is triggered manually by the user or in preparation for a program download. Next, let's examine what happens to register values when an OCS controller is placed in stop mode, run mode, and on a power cycle. Now here I'm talking specifically about the registers, not the variables that are mapped to them. When an OCS is placed in stop mode, or it loses power, all register types retain their values, even non-retentive register types. It's only upon going back into run mode that non-retentive register types are cleared and retentive register types are allowed to hold their previous value from before the download or before the power cycle. With Cscape 9, the value that a variable contains on run or on power up is strictly dependent on the register location it is mapped to at the time. With Cscape 9, what that means is this. If variables are added, deleted, or remapped between downloads, variables can be mapped to different register locations after a download. For variables mapped to retentive registers, that means it's possible for mismatches to occur. Variables just created prior to a new download could be mapped to register locations that already contain non-zero data. Existing variables might now be mapped to new register locations that do not contain the value of that variable prior to its download. This remapping is something that has to be managed by system designers, and if not managed, it can cause undesired results after a download. How can this be managed in Cscape 9? Well, there are a few different ways. First, all register locations could be cleared prior to the download from the Cscape Tools menu. Another option would be to utilize the set points feature so that some variables always contain the same value on a stop to run transition. Or finally, for variables that absolutely must retain their value even through major program changes, these variables could be manually mapped. But with Cscape 10, enhancements to the download process have now eliminated variable value mismatches to begin with. So in a lot of cases, the system designer doesn't need to worry about taking any of these steps. First of all, to take advantage of this new download process, you'll need to be sure that the firmware in your controller is up to date. The various firmware versions for each controller series are shown here on the screen. With these versions, you'll be able to take advantage of the new download process in Cscape 10. Also, note that the X2 controller and older generations of the XLE and XLT are not supported with this new download process due to memory constraints. Now, after all that Cscape 9 review, let's get into Cscape 10 and the improvements that have been made to the download process and specifically to variable handling. As far as the variable mapping process goes, that has not changed. The same rules are followed by Cscape 10 as they were in Cscape 9 when internal variables are mapped in the background. The first change that has been made is in the initialization of global variables. With Cscape 9, global variables strictly initialize based on their register location and the retained value of that specific register on PowerUp. With Cscape 10, the initial value column of the program variable window is now active. If it is desired for a global variable to initialize to a specific value, that can be plugged in by the user in the init value column of the program variable window. So if a value has been specified in that column, the global variable will always initialize to that value. Also, in Cscape 10, the default behavior of variables and their values after a download and on every run, transition, and PowerUp has changed. Let's start with global variables that do not have a specified initial value. In Cscape 10, those global variables will always initialize to 0. Also, for retained variables, value mismatches that we talked about with Cscape 9 can no longer occur. A retained variable will always retain its previous value, whether the register it is mapped to by Cscape has changed or not since the last download. And for new retained variables created after the previous download, those will always start out initialized at 0. Let's take a look at additions to the download dialog box that pops up every time a program download is initiated. You'll see two new choices. On every download, the user has the ability to keep current values for all existing retained variables, which is the default behavior. Again, when choosing this option, you do not need to worry about any value mismatches from one download to the next. The second new choice is Clear all retained values. There are some situations where this might be desirable. For instance, if you are loading a brand new program completely different from the previous application in that same controller, and some variable names might overlap between the old program and the new program, you might want to start fresh with all retained variables cleared. Before we move on to the next Cscape 10 enhancement, let's be clear about existing variables versus new variables. A variable is only considered existing if its name, type, and dimension have not changed. So if you change the name of a variable, it is considered a new variable. If you change a variable from integer to double integer, for instance, it is also considered a new variable. If you change the dimension of an array type variable, say from 16 to 32, it is now a new variable. And of course, all new variables are initialized on their first stop to run transition. Finally, let's talk about global variable behavior and how we can adjust that if we do not want to accept the new default behavior in Cscape 10. To change global variable behavior, press the quick menu button in the upper left-hand corner of Cscape 10. Click on Settings. In the Compiler Options tab, you will find the following options. The first choice is the default. Global variables will initialize on entering run mode, as we've discussed. Global variables with a value plugged into the init value column of the program variable window will initialize to that value, otherwise they will initialize to 0. For the second option, all global variables initialize at 0 on every run transition, regardless of the init value column in the program variable window. For the third option, global variables not mapped to %t are retained. This is not the recommended behavior, but it is an option. Finally, if you prefer for global variables to behave exactly as they did in Cscape 9, you can select the last option. Generally, I would accept the default choice, but for an existing program that was created in Cscape 9, you might want to select the last option. Let's go ahead and summarize our key content for today. The new behavior of Cscape 10 as it relates to variable handling on and after downloads. Cscape 10 eliminates all retained variable mismatches, a common complaint of users of variable-based advanced ladder in Cscape 9. Also, on every individual program download, users are given the option to retain or clear retained variables. So if you have a situation in which you'd prefer to start over again with your retained variable values, you can easily do that. Finally, global variable handling has been enhanced by default. All global variables, regardless of type, are initialized on every run transition. And if you prefer a different behavior, you have the ability to adjust that under Settings. So that does it for our technical content for today. Here's our topic for next week. Next week, our topic is Cscape 10 graphics editing, and that will apply regardless of the OCS model that you typically use. And we've also announced that we have a Cscape 10 launch webinar, in which we'll also be covering the new Canvas OCS series, that will take place on June 27th at 2 o'clock. And you'll need to register for that on the Horner Automation website. And this is just prior to the official release of Cscape 10, which happens on July 1st. For those of you who haven't subscribed to our channel, don't hesitate to do so. It doesn't cost anything. And if you choose notifications when you subscribe, you'll be notified every time we go live or every time we post a new video. Now, if you're interested in train travel as a bucket list item, stick around for a couple of minutes and I'll give you some pointers. Otherwise, let's all get out there and do us some good. Thanks for sticking around. If overnight train travel might be on your bucket list at some point, I have some recommendations for you. One of the best reasons to take the train is for the scenery, and these 3 trains have the best scenery in the United States. The California Zephyr from Chicago to the Bay Area, the Coast Starlight, which runs along the Pacific Coast, and the Empire Builder, which runs along the northern United States from Chicago to Seattle. They all have terrific scenery. They also all feature superliner equipment. These are double-decker train cars, which are a little older, but they have some great features for seeing the scenery, including a sightseer lounge. It's kind of an observation car with wraparound windows where you can go to watch the scenery when you're not in your coach seat or in your sleeping compartment. These trains also have full-service diners, which is important when you're on a longer train ride. You want better food. Then there's the scenery itself. It can be really spectacular. Here's a shot of the California Zephyr going through the Sierra Nevadas, or maybe it's the Rockies. It goes through both of them. Pretty awesome. There's also another view on the same train where it almost looks like you're in the desert or the high plains. The views change from really 1 hour to the next. It's really pretty amazing. Another great Western train is the Empire Builder, here shown going through Montana. The northern United States is an area that a lot of people don't get to because it's fairly remote. Another favorite train is the Coast Starlight. This one runs along the Pacific coastline. For a good part of it, it runs right along the Pacific Ocean. You get some great views, including this one, of a little seaside town along the route. Maybe you're interested in an overnight train ride because you're curious about sleeping on the train. Well, the Silver Meteor and Silver Star have terrific sleepers. You start out in New York, which is a great place to start. It's a destination on its own, and you end up in Miami Beach, Florida, which is a great place to be, especially in the winter. Now, these trains have Viewliner 2 equipment, which is some of the newest that Amtrak has. The Viewliner 2s include a dining car, which again is always important for a long distance train, and they have full service meals. They have bedrooms. Here's one set up for the daytime. Here's a shot of a bedroom set up for the nighttime. As you can see, ready for a lie-flat bed. Also, you've got an ensuite available, in the bedrooms at least. And if you have a roomette, a much smaller room, shown here, it has one of my favorite features, which is a large window next to the upper bunk where I can kick back, lie flat, and watch the world go by with all kinds of interesting flashing lights and sounds. Now, all the trains I've featured on this video have pretty decent food, and here are some of my favorite dishes. Let's start with breakfast, where you have several choices, but my favorite is railroad French toast. Now at lunch, there are some healthier options like this salad, but I'm normally going for the bacon cheeseburger, which is pretty good. At dinner time, you have your choice of appetizer. I think we've got some coconut shrimp here. And then my favorite for an entree is the flat iron steak. Now it actually tastes much better than it looks. Sometimes they serve it with mashed potatoes, sometimes with a baked potato. And let's finish up with some of my favorite desserts, starting with the blueberry cheesecake, transitioning to delicious lemon cake, and then finishing up with flourless chocolate cake. Desserts on Amtrak in the full-service diners are really good. So once again, thanks for sticking around to learn a little bit about long-distance train travel, and we'll see you next week for another great technical topic.